Hold on tight, because the story you are about to hear is not for the faint of heart. Have you ever thought you truly knew someone only to discover you have been sleeping next to the enemy? That is exactly what happened to Bryce Harrington. Picture this. Friday night on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. Bryce, 37, built like a weapon in a three-piece black suit, was the kind of man whose name was whispered in fear across every dark corner of New York. On paper, a real estate mogul. In reality, the head of the Harrington Empire. But for all his power, Bryce was blind. Blind in love with the wrong woman. He was walking toward his Rolls Royce, whistling, spinning his keys. His fiancée, Tanya, had asked him to grab champagne from the trunk for their engagement party. "Coming, babe," he murmured, thinking how perfect his life was. Poor fool. He had no idea his world was about to shatter. He popped the trunk and froze. The keys slipped from his fingers, clinking against the asphalt. His eyes that had stared down dangerous men without flinching went wide with pure shock. There, curled up like a wounded animal inside his trunk, was Melody, his housekeeper, 27 years old, her blue uniform torn and filthy, lips split open, a bruise darkening her cheek, and clutched against her trembling body, wrapped in old blankets, were two newborn babies, their tiny faces red from crying in silence. Melody looked up at him, not with relief, but with raw terror. "Please do not kill me, Mr. Harrington," she sobbed, pulling the babies tighter. "I swear I did not do anything wrong." For the first time in his ruthless life, the head of the Harrington Empire had absolutely no idea what to do. His mouth open to demand answers, his mind desperately trying to comprehend why his gentle housekeeper was bleeding in his trunk with two hidden infants. But before a single word could leave his lips, the sharp, aggressive clack of stiletto heels violently shattered the quiet night. Tanya burst out into the driveway, her expensive designer gown shimmering under the security lights. Her eyes darted to the open trunk, and for a fraction of a second, genuine panic flashed across her perfectly manicured face. But dangerous people move fast, and Tanya was a master of survival. In a heartbeat, she masked her terror with a theatrical, blood-curdling scream that echoed off the stone walls of the mansion. "You thief! You monster!" she shrieked, charging forward and pointing a trembling finger at the bruised housekeeper. Instantly flipping the narrative, Tanya accused Melody of violently kidnapping her distant relatives in a deranged plot to extort the Harrington wealth. Melody shook her head wildly, tears streaming down her bruised face, but she was too terrified to speak. Moving with calculated speed, Tanya pulled out her phone and called the 19th precinct directly, bypassing the regular emergency lines. Within minutes, the wail of sirens tore the night open, and a heavily armed squad of 6 officers swarmed the mansion's massive iron gates. The police poured out of their cruisers, hands on their weapons, their faces hard and uncompromising. They took one look at the opulent surroundings, the crying billionaire's fiancé, and the filthy, bleeding maid curled in the trunk. The verdict was decided before a single question was asked. "Step away from the children," the lead officer barked, his voice dripping with authority and contempt. They refused to listen to a battered maid over a woman dripping in diamonds. 2 officers lunged forward, grabbing Melody by her slender arms and hauling her out onto the rough asphalt. "No, please, they're in danger," Melody screamed, thrashing against the officer's iron grip. "She will kill them, you have to protect them." The officers ignored her desperate pleas, brutally wrenching the crying infants from her arms and handing them over to a sobbing Tanya. The click of cold metal handcuffs snapping shut around Melody's thin wrists sounded like a death sentence in the quiet driveway. As they dragged her roughly toward the back of the waiting police cruiser, Melody twisted her body around, fighting the hold just long enough to lock eyes with Bryce. He stood frozen, an immovable statue, his mind racing to connect the shattered pieces of his reality. "Mr. Harrington, please. Check the yellow blanket. Look for the letter." Melody shrieked, her voice tearing at the seams as they shoved her into the dark car. The heavy door slammed shut, cutting off her cries, but those words hung in the air like a lit fuse. The police cruisers disappeared at the end of the street, their sirens shrinking until they dissolved into the cold New York night. But Bryce still stood there in the dead, quiet road, with Melody's final desperate words echoing in his head like a bell that would not stop ringing. Tanya had already rushed back inside to play the traumatized victim for their wealthy guests, leaving him entirely alone in the empty driveway. Bryce turned slowly toward the open trunk of the Rolls Royce, his feet feeling like lead as he stared into the dark space. The dim light threw pale shadows across the wrinkles of the old blankets Melody had used to shield the infants from the freezing air. He reached out with hands that had signed multi-million-dollar contracts without a tremor, his fingers brushing against a worn yellow blanket stained with tiny drops of blood. And there, tucked deep within its frayed folds, he felt the stiff edge of paper. He pulled it out under the harsh glare of the security lights, and his breath caught sharply in his throat. It was a white envelope, crumpled and smeared with dirt, but the handwriting on the front was unmistakably clear. It was Keith's handwriting, messy and slanted, with the way the letters are curved in that strange, familiar way. Keith was his younger brother, the only family Bryce had left, who had died a year ago in a horrific car crash the police had ruled a tragic accident. Bryce felt his knees go completely weak, leaning heavily against the side of the expensive car as his fingers worked the damp envelope open. The paper inside was soaked with Melody's tears from her agonizing hours trapped in the suffocating darkness of the trunk. He lifted it to the light and began to read the hurried words written by a dead man. "Bryce, my brother, if you are reading this letter, it means I am no longer in this world." Keith wrote that he had fallen in love and had secret twin babies, 2 little angels he had hidden because he was terrified. "Tanya found out about my children, and she threatened to destroy everything if I ever claimed my share of the inheritance." The next sentence hit Bryce with the force of a speeding train, shattering every illusion he had ever held about the woman wearing his engagement ring. "The accident last month was not an accident, brother. Tanya arranged it because she is obsessed with the Harrington money, and she will kill anyone in her way." Bryce folded the paper back up slowly, carefully, as if pressing too hard would make him break apart with it. He dropped to his knees right there in the middle of the road on the cold asphalt, both hands gripping the letter tightly against his chest. A profound, guttural sound tore out of his throat, not a sob, but the raw noise of a man doing everything in his power not to scream into the night. His brother had been murdered, slaughtered like an animal, and the person who had ordered the kill was inside his house drinking champagne. Rage surged up like dynamite, scorching and roaring from his stomach to his chest, demanding blood and immediate violence. He wanted to storm into that glittering ballroom, grab Tanya by the throat in front of 200 guests, and demand to know why she took his only brother. But Bryce Harrington was not an ordinary man. He was the head of a shadow empire, and the first rule of his dark world was never to act while anger was in control. The man who let emotion lead would always die first. He breathed in slow and deep, forcing the violent fire down, compressing it and transforming it into something much colder and sharper. Bryce stood up from the asphalt, his face settling into a blank, iron mask that gave absolutely nothing away. He slipped the tear-stained letter into the inner pocket of his suit jacket, pressing it close to his heart where a new, deadly rhythm had begun to beat. He adjusted his collar, smoothed his dark hair, and walked back up the marble steps of the mansion as if nothing had shattered his reality. He pushed open the heavy oak doors, stepping back into the overflowing party filled with soft jazz, clinking glasses, and the scent of expensive perfume. No one looking at the perfectly tailored real estate mogul could guess that a ruthless mafia boss had just awakened behind his cold gray eyes. Bryce took a fresh drink from a passing server, sipped once, and began to scan the crowded room with the quiet precision of a predator. He did not have to wait long. Through the sea of laughing elites, he spotted Tanya standing in a shadowy alcove near the back terrace, her back turned to the crowd. One hand covered her mouth while the other held her phone tight against her ear, her voice low, urgent, and razor cold as she delivered her deadly instructions to finish the job. Bryce stood perfectly still behind a marble pillar, the clinking of champagne glasses and the soft notes of a saxophone masking the sound of his breathing. Less than 10 feet away, Tanya was murmuring into her phone, her voice dripping with venom. "Benny, listen to me very carefully," she hissed, her diamond necklace glittering under the dim terrace lights. "I do not care how you do it, just get your men into that kitchen and make those brats disappear permanently tonight." Bryce tightened his grip on his heavy crystal glass until his knuckles turned completely white, the urge to crush it almost overwhelming. Benny the Rat was a name Bryce knew intimately well in the dark underworld of New York. He was a filthy, opportunistic scavenger who took the gruesome jobs no self-respecting monster would ever touch. Tanya had just ordered a hit on his murdered brother's newborn children while standing inside his own home. He did not confront her, he did not scream, and he did not throw his glass against the wall. Instead, Bryce turned on his heel and melted back into the crowd of laughing elites, slipping his phone from his pocket with smooth, terrifying precision. He fired off a single, encrypted text message to 2 names in his contacts that no one in this high society gathering would ever recognize. Vincent and Ray were not mere event security, they were Bryce's elite, most lethal enforcers, men who would burn a city to ash the moment their boss gave the order. For hostiles entering the service hallway, neutralized silently. No survivors. He hit send, sliding the phone away and grabbing a fresh drink from a passing tray to maintain the perfect illusion of a happy host. The jazz music continued to flow smoothly, expensive perfume filled the air, and 200 wealthy guests laughed, completely oblivious to the brutal war about to erupt mere feet away. Down in the narrow, dimly lit service hallway that led directly to the mansion's massive kitchen, Benny the Rat and 3 heavily armed thugs crept forward. They wore cheap, wrinkled suits, moving with the clumsy panic of cockroaches trying to scurry across a pristine white tablecloth. Benny's hand reached out, his greasy fingers barely grazing the brass handle of the kitchen door. He never even had the chance to turn the knob. Like 2 enormous shadows detaching from the walls, Vincent and Ray materialized behind the hitmen in absolute silence. Massive hands clamped down like iron vices around Benny's throat, lifting him completely off the ground before a single sound could escape his lips. The 3 thugs barely had time to widen their eyes in shock before the enforcers moved with blinding, brutal efficiency. Bones snapped with hollow, sickening crunches, heavy bodies were slammed into the thick concrete walls, and the hit squad was dismantled in less than 10 seconds, without a single gunshot being fired. Bryce stood at the top of the stairs, watching the silent, violent execution with eyes as cold and unforgiving as a winter storm. He gave Vincent a single, sharp nod, stepping past the unconscious bodies and pushing the heavy kitchen doors wide open. The sight that greeted him inside made his hardened heart, a heart forged by years of ruthless underworld warfare, soften in a way it had not in a lifetime. Martha, the elderly cook who had served the Harrington family since Bryce was a small boy, was sitting on the polished tile floor. The 2 tiny babies lay swaddled in clean towels inside a large wicker laundry basket, nestled safely among scattered bags of flour and fresh herbs. She was gently feeding them warm milk from 2 small bottles she must have desperately scrambled to find hidden in the massive pantry. The babies had finally stopped crying, their tiny eyes squeezed shut, and their small, fragile hands wrapped tightly around Martha's aged fingers as if clinging to their last thread of safety. "Mr. Bryce," Martha whispered, her voice trembling as she looked up with tears in her eyes. "Miss Tanya told me to leave them alone. She said someone was coming to take them away, but they were so hungry, sir." Bryce did not answer right away, stepping closer to the basket and dropping to one knee on the hard kitchen floor. One of the babies slowly opened its eyes, and Bryce felt the breath completely leave his lungs. Those eyes were deep, clear, and striking gray, the exact same eyes that had looked back at him from his brother Keith's face for 30 years. Bryce offered his large index finger, gently touching the infant's tiny hand, and instantly, 5 little fingers closed around it with a desperate, shocking strength. That fleeting, silent moment in the kitchen sealed the fate of everyone who had dared to cross the Harrington bloodline. Bryce gently pulled his hand back, standing up to his full height, his voice now carrying the absolute, final authority of a Mafia king. "No one takes them, Martha, no one," he commanded, his tone leaving absolutely no room for hesitation or debate. "You feed them, you protect them, and Vincent will stand guard at this door with a loaded weapon until I say otherwise." He pulled out his phone one last time, dialing his attorney and his private doctor with a ruthless, singular purpose. "Bring the emergency DNA kits and get to the mansion right now. We have a war to win tonight." The 19th precinct at night was the saddest place anyone could ever imagine. Deep in the freezing basement, the holding cells reeked of stale sweat, cheap bleach, and suffocating despair. The heavy steel doors slammed shut, locking Melody inside a damp, overcrowded cage with strangers who stared with hollow eyes. The guards had ruthlessly stripped her of her warm coat and her shoes, leaving her shivering and barefoot on the freezing concrete floor. She pulled her knees tight to her chest, her thin, torn blue uniform offering absolutely no protection against the biting cold. But as she sat in the miserable darkness, she was not crying for herself. She gently kissed her own bruised palm, feeling the phantom warmth of the 2 tiny lives she had cradled in the suffocating trunk. If enduring this freezing hell meant those babies were safe, she would sit on this unforgiving concrete floor forever. She thought of Mr. Harrington's cold gray eyes, praying desperately that he had found the letter and understood the truth. Back at the glittering mansion, the illusion of perfect control was rapidly crumbling into dust. Tanya paced the length of her locked private study, her knuckles turning white as she clutched her sleek phone. Benny the Rat had gone completely dark, his phone routing straight to a dead voicemail over and over again. She knew instinctively that the kitchen hit had failed, and sheer panic clawed at her throat like a wild animal trying to escape. But dangerous people knew how to adapt, and Tanya was a master of the ruthless pivot. She pulled a disposable burner phone from the hidden back compartment of her desk drawer and dialed a number she kept strictly for emergencies. A rough, heavy voice answered on the second ring, belonging to a corrupt guard deep inside the prison system. "I need the maid's silence before sunrise," Tanya hissed, her voice venomous and frantic. "Make it look like a tragic suicide, and I will wire $150,000 into your offshore account right now." The bloody deal was struck in a matter of seconds, sealing a quiet death warrant for a girl who only wanted to help. Down in the shadowed depths of the holding block, the wheels of Tanya's deadly transaction immediately began to turn. The heavy iron gate creaked open, and the other inmates instantly scattered, pressing their backs against the damp walls in absolute terror. A massive woman stepped into the dim yellow light, her broad shoulders shifting with heavy, predatory muscle. A jagged white scar ran down her cheek, and her flat, dead eyes locked directly onto the trembling housekeeper. She moved slowly across the small cell, one hand completely hidden behind her back in a terrifying, calculated stride. When she was only a few feet away, she revealed a hard plastic toothbrush that had been ruthlessly filed down into a lethal, pointed shiv. "Heard you have been causing trouble on the outside, little bird," the prison boss sneered, her voice sounding like grinding stones. "Someone paid a lot of money to make sure you do not wake up tomorrow." Any ordinary woman would have collapsed into tears and begged for a mercy that did not exist in this dark place. But Melody was not an ordinary woman. She was a survivor who had fought for every scrap of air since she was an orphaned child on the unforgiving streets. The paralyzing fear in her chest instantly hardened into something sharp, cold, and metallic. She did not scream for guards who had already been bought, and she did not cower against the rusted steel bars. Instead, Melody slowly rose to her bare feet, her jaw setting with a fierce, unbreakable resolve. She backed up strategically until her shoulders met the solid concrete wall, eliminating any chance of a fatal attack from behind. She raised her bruised fists into a tight, defensive guard, her deep brown eyes burning with a sudden, ferocious light. She was ready to bleed, ready to fight, and absolutely ready to die if it meant taking the secret of Keith's children safely to the grave. Back at the heavily guarded mansion, the private doctor emerged from the makeshift laboratory with a single, damning sheet of paper. He looked directly at Bryce and nodded, confirming a 99.9% match to the Harrington bloodline. Those two fragile infants in the kitchen were Keith's children, and they were the rightful heirs to the Empire. Armed with this undeniable truth, Bryce did not hesitate for a single second. He walked out into the freezing night and ordered his driver to the 19th precinct, his face set in a mask of absolute, terrifying fury. He stormed through the front doors of the station, flanked by his highest-ranking lawyers and men in sharp black suits. He did not ask for permission, and he did not wait in line. He slammed an unprecedented sum of cash down on the front desk, bypassing every legal protocol with the sheer, crushing weight of his underworld influence. The terrified desk sergeant scrambled to process the historic bail, his hands shaking under the lethal gaze of the Harrington boss. Bryce did not even wait for the paperwork to be fully stamped before he marched straight past the security checkpoint and descended into the dark basement holding cells. Down in the freezing depths of the jail, the massive prison boss lunged at Melody with her sharpened toothbrush, aiming straight for her chest. Melody braced herself, her bare feet planted firmly on the icy concrete, completely prepared to take the fatal blow. But before the crude weapon could break her skin, the heavy iron door of the holding block was kicked open with the force of a bomb detonating. The deafening crash echoed through the damp walls, and the massive inmate froze mid-strike. Bryce stepped into the dim yellow light, his three-piece suit perfectly crisped, his gray eyes burning with a dark, apocalyptic fire. He did not shout, and he did not draw a weapon. He simply leveled a single, lethal glare at the scarred woman, a look that carried the weight of 1,000 violent deaths. The hardened prison boss recognized the devil when she saw him, and the plastic shiv slipped from her trembling fingers, clattering uselessly against the floor. She backed away into the shadows, completely terrified by the silent king of the New York underworld. Bryce stepped into the cell, ignoring the stench and the filth, and wrapped his expensive wool coat around Melody's violently shaking shoulders. He guided her out of that freezing hellhole without saying a single word, his strong arm wrapping protectively around her waist. They bypassed the stunned police officers and walked straight out into the crisp, biting night air. He led her into the waiting Rolls Royce, the tinted windows instantly shielding them from the harsh reality of the city. Bryce ordered the driver to head to Lower Manhattan, straight to his secret, heavily guarded penthouse in Tribeca. It was a fortress in the sky that no one in his violent world knew about, not even Tanya. When the private elevator opened into the sprawling, dimly lit apartment, Melody stopped dead in her tracks. There, in the center of the plush living room, Martha was sitting in a comfortable chair next to a warm bassinet. Melody's legs gave out, and she collapsed to her knees on the expensive hardwood floor. She crawled toward the bassinet, tears pouring down her bruised face as she saw the two tiny twins sleeping safely in clean, soft blankets. She buried her face against the edge of the crib, sobbing with a profound, shattering relief that echoed through the quiet penthouse. Bryce stood in the doorway, watching the battered, courageous housekeeper weep over the family she had risked her life to save, and the very last remnants of his frozen heart melted completely away. The sprawling penthouse was wrapped in a heavy, protective silence, high above the glittering violence of the city. Bryce did not sit on the imported leather sofas, but dropped down directly onto the expensive hardwood floor right beside Melody. He rested his broad shoulders against the wall and finally broke the suffocating quiet. He pulled the crumpled, tear-stained letter from his jacket pocket and handed it to the trembling girl. He told her everything in a low, steady voice that left absolutely no room for doubt. He explained how his brother Keith had been murdered by the woman wearing his engagement ring. He revealed the rapid DNA results that proved the two sleeping infants were the last true heirs of the Harrington bloodline. Tanya had orchestrated a massive, ruthless plot to slaughter his entire family just to secure the empire for herself. Melody listened with wide, horrified eyes, her small hands clutching the edges of the warm blanket Martha had wrapped around her. Bryce turned his head to look directly into her bruised, exhausted face, and his gray eyes burned with a terrifying, absolute certainty. He told her they were going back to the mansion tonight, right into the heart of the glittering engagement party. They were not returning as a powerful mafia boss and a broken housekeeper, but they were walking through those doors as absolute equals to destroy Tanya. Melody shrank back against the wall, her chest heaving with a sudden, overwhelming panic. "I cannot do this," she whispered, shaking her head frantically. "I am just a poor maid who only knows how to scrub floors, and I do not belong in high society." She was terrified they would look at her bruises and her cheap clothes and laugh her right out of the ballroom. But Bryce reached out, his large, calloused hand gently catching her trembling chin, forcing her to meet his unwavering gaze. "You are completely wrong," Bryce said, his voice dropping to a rough, commanding whisper that demanded total attention. "You willingly climbed into the freezing darkness of a trunk to die for two babies you did not even know." He firmly assured her that her absolute bravery made her worth more than every single billionaire standing in that opulent ballroom combined. He needed her brave, honest, and standing right by his side when the entire stage collapsed on Tanya's head. Martha stepped into the living room, a warm, reassuring smile breaking across her aged, tear-stained face. The loyal cook took Melody gently by the hand and led her down the hallway into the massive master suite. Martha opened a cedar closet and pulled out a breathtaking, unworn emerald silk gown that Bryce had purchased for a charity gala long ago. The older woman helped Melody wash away the grime and the blood, brushing out her dark hair into soft, flowing waves. She applied a light touch of makeup, just enough to hide the darkest bruises, and helped her slip into the shimmering silk dress. Bryce stood alone in the quiet hallway, leaning heavily against the wall as he waited for the door to open. He was a man who had stared down the barrel of a loaded gun without ever blinking, and he had negotiated with the deadliest cartels on the coast without breaking a sweat. But when the heavy wooden door finally clicked and swung open, the feared, untouchable mafia boss was rendered utterly speechless. Melody stood in the soft light of the doorway, the rich emerald silk hugging her slender frame and flowing down to the floor like liquid glass. Her dark hair cascaded over her bare shoulders, and her deep brown eyes shone with a new, unbreakable dignity. She did not look like a battered maid anymore, and she did not look like a frightened victim running from the dark. She looked like a queen forged in absolute fire, beautiful in a raw, powerful way that no amount of dirty money could ever buy. Bryce swallowed hard, his throat suddenly tight, realizing with terrifying clarity that he could never let this incredible woman walk out of his life. The heavy tires of the black Rolls Royce crunched against the gravel as it pulled up to the towering iron gates of the Harrington mansion. The night sky suddenly erupted with a blinding storm of camera flashes, capturing the arrival of New York's most feared and powerful man. Bryce stepped out into the crisp air, his tailored three-piece suit absorbing the harsh light like absolute darkness. He did not rush, and he did not glance at the shouting paparazzi swarming the velvet ropes. Instead, He turned back to the open car door and offered his large hand inside. Melody placed her trembling fingers into a steady palm, and she stepped out into the blinding glare. The emerald silk gown caught the camera flashes, throwing them back in brilliant shards of green light. She held her head high, her dark hair catching the midnight breeze as she walked shoulder to shoulder with the Mafia boss. They moved up the red carpet as a completely united front, exuding a lethal grace that made the chaotic crowd suddenly fall into a stunned, breathless silence. Inside the massive grand hall, the engagement party was reaching its dazzling, champagne-fueled peak. Tanya stood at the top of the curved marble staircase, absolutely dripping in imported diamonds and a glittering gold gown. She was holding court like a conquering queen, flashing her manufactured, perfect smile at the 200 elite guests hanging on her every word. She believed her victory was absolute, completely confident that the pathetic little maid was already bleeding out on a freezing prison floor. But then the heavy oak doors swung open and the ambient jazz music seemed to instantly die in the air. Tanya casually glanced down at the grand entrance, and her perfectly painted smile froze completely on her face. She saw Bryce walking in with a woman draped in breathtaking emerald silk holding his arm. When Tanya recognized the bruised but radiant face of the housekeeper she had paid $150,000 to have slaughtered, her lungs forgot how to breathe. The crystal champagne flute slipped straight through her trembling fingers, hitting the polished marble floor and shattering into 100 glittering pieces. The sharp crash of breaking glass echoed through the suddenly quiet ballroom, drawing the wide eyes of every single guest in the room. Tanya drew a sharp, panicked breath, forcing her manicured claws into her palms to ground herself in reality. She pasted a sickeningly sweet smile back onto her face, descending the marble stairs with her heels clicking like the countdown to an explosion. "Oh, Bryce, darling," Tanya called out loudly, her shrill voice designed to humiliate and echo across the entire hall. "I did not realize we were hosting a charity event tonight. Did you really have to bring your filthy little maid to our engagement party?" A few nervous, cruel laughs scattered through the wealthy crowd as they stared at the woman in the green dress. In the past, Melody would have shrunk away, bowing her head and apologizing for simply existing in their presence. But tonight, the terrified orphan was gone, replaced by a woman who had already survived the absolute worst of the dark. Melody did not look down, she did not flinch, and she stared straight into the cold eyes of the murderer. "I am exactly where I belong," Tanya, Melody said, her voice terrifyingly calm and carrying clearly to the very back of the silent room. "And if I were you, I would stop worrying about my dress, because every single one of your lies is ending tonight." Whispers immediately erupted across the grand hall like a sudden, vicious fire. The 200 wealthy guests exchanged confused, hungry glances as the tension in the room thickened into something suffocating. Tanya felt her perfect world slipping straight through her trembling fingers, and pure panic began to claw fiercely at her throat. She gathered the heavy skirts of her gold gown and rushed toward the raised stage at the back of the ballroom. She snatched the microphone from the startled host, her chest heaving as she forced a wide, manic smile onto her pale face. "Ladies and gentlemen, please excuse the little interruption tonight," she announced, her shrill voice echoing off the high, painted ceilings. "Bryce and I are just so overwhelmed with love that we have decided to move our wedding up to tomorrow morning." A few scattered, hesitant claps trickled through the massive room, but the oppressive silence quickly swallowed them whole. Bryce did not stay back in the shadows, and he did not let the pathetic lie stand for another second. He stepped onto the stage with the slow, terrifyingly measured pace of an apex predator closing in on its trapped prey. He smoothly took the microphone right out of her shaking hand, his gray eyes locking onto hers with absolute, freezing contempt. "There will be no wedding tomorrow, Tanya, and there will be no more lies tonight," Bryce said, his deep voice carrying a lethal, undeniable authority. He turned away from her completely and gave a single, sharp nod to his men waiting up in the sound booth. Instantly, the giant projector screens that were meant to display their romantic engagement photos flickered and blazed to life. The massive screens projected a highly classified medical document bearing the official seal of the city's top genetic laboratory. The bold, black words were massive and impossible for anyone in the room to misunderstand or ignore. The results confirmed a 99.9% DNA match, proving the two hidden infants were the biological children of the late Keith Harrington. The entire ballroom erupted into a massive, collective gasp as the shocking realization hit the high society crowd. Bryce lifted his free hand and pointed directly at Melody, who stood tall and radiant in her emerald gown near the front of the stage. "Those babies are my family, and they're alive tonight only because this incredible woman risked her own life to save them from a murderer," Bryce declared, his voice ringing with absolute pride and lethal warning. Tanya could not maintain the facade for another second as her entire empire of deceit burned to ash around her. She lunged forward, her face twisting into a hideous mask of pure desperation as she shrieked into the echoing hall. "It is a lie. Everything up there is completely forged," she screamed, pointing a violently shaking finger at Melody. "She is just a filthy con artist trying to steal my money, and you cannot believe a single word she says." Bryce slowly turned his head to look at the screaming woman, his expression completely devoid of any pity or warmth. "Forged," Bryce repeated softly, the chilling word cutting through her hysterical screams like a sharpened blade. He signaled the sound booth one final time, and the expensive surround sound system pumped out a crystal-clear, damning audio recording. Tanya's own cold, vicious voice filled the ballroom, explicitly ordering Benny the Rat to infiltrate the kitchen and make the infants disappear permanently. The recording echoed into silence, leaving a suffocating, horrifying weight pressing down on the 200 elite guests. The wealthy socialites and powerful businessmen recoiled in absolute, visceral disgust, their faces pale with shock. They physically backed away from the stage in a massive, sweeping wave, dragging their silk dresses and expensive suits away from the monster in gold. Tanya stood completely alone under the blinding spotlights, surrounded by an ocean of disgust, entirely stripped of every single lie she had ever told. The crushing weight of absolute exposure pressed down on Tanya as she stood completely alone under the blinding spotlights. She looked to the right and saw faces turning away in pure disgust, and she looked to the left to see the very society she worshipped shrinking back in horror. There was no escape left, no perfect lie to spin, and no mask thick enough to hide the monster she truly was. In that exact moment, Tanya Whitfield did not break down and cry. Instead, her mind completely and violently shattered. A low, ragged sound tore out of her throat, building quickly into a manic, terrifying laugh that made the hair on the back of every guest's neck stand straight up. It was the shattered laughter of a mind hitting its absolute limit and ripping every single restraint clean in half. Still laughing, her hand plunged deep into her beaded evening clutch and pulled out a gleaming silver pistol. It was the heavy, deadly weapon she had stolen directly from Bryce's private safe the night before, and she raised it high for the entire ballroom to see. The sight of the cold steel triggered instantaneous, deafening chaos across the grand hall. 200 wealthy elites screamed in pure terror, dropping their expensive champagne flutes and diving wildly under the heavy banquet tables to hide. But Tanya did not freeze in the pandemonium. Moving with the erratic, terrifying speed of a cornered animal, she lunged right off the low stage and aimed straight toward the emerald gown. Her manicured hand violently grabbed a fistful of Melody's dark hair, jerking the smaller woman backward with brutal force. Tanya slammed the barrel of the silver pistol tight against Melody's temple, her fingers slipping dangerously close to the trigger. Melody sucked in a sharp, painful breath, but the brave housekeeper did not scream, and she did not try to fight. She simply stood completely still, her deep brown eyes locking directly onto Bryce, silently begging him not to do anything reckless. The entire ballroom froze in a new, suffocating kind of terror, watching the psychotic bride hold the innocent maid hostage under the glittering lights. "Nobody take another step," Tanya shrieked, her voice booming raw and unhinged over the panicked sobs of the hidden guests. The gun pressed so hard against Melody's skin that it left an angry red mark. "I want $1.8 million in untraceable cash right now, Bryce, and I want the keys to your private jet." She was completely unhinged, her eyes darting wildly around the room as she demanded immediate, safe passage out of the state before the police sirens could reach the mansion gates. She sneered, her breath coming in ragged, desperate heaves as she pulled Melody tighter against her chest. "If you try to stop me, or if the cops walk through those doors, I will paint this pretty green dress completely red." Tanya was no longer a calculating socialite playing a game of chess. She was a deeply unstable, wild threat, entirely capable of pulling the trigger just to watch the world burn down with her. Bryce Harrington stood dead still, his expensive black suit blending into the dark shadows of the chaotic room. This was a man who had negotiated face-to-face with heavily armed drug lords and walked through absolute war zones without his heart rate ever spiking. But looking at the cold metal trembling violently against Melody's soft skin, a completely foreign and terrifying sensation crashed over him. It was pure, suffocating, paralyzing fear. It was not fear for his own life, because he had been ready to die for a long time, but a gut-wrenching terror for the beautiful woman he realized he could not live without. His large hands curled into tight fists at his sides, his knuckles turning completely white as he desperately calculated every possible angle of attack. But the risk was far too massive, and a single mistake would cost Melody her life. Bryce forced his face to remain as cold and unreadable as carved stone, suppressing the violent roar in his chest, knowing he had to play the madwoman's game to keep the love of his life breathing. The heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom suddenly slammed open with a deafening boom. The violent sound completely shattered the suffocating standoff, drawing every single terrified eye toward the entrance. A motorized wheelchair rolled slowly into the glittering room, carrying a woman who absolutely refused to be forgotten. It was Harriet Whitfield, Tanya's 82-year-old grandmother. The formidable matriarch Tanya had illegally locked away in a distant Florida nursing home. Harriet looked frail in her thick wool coat, but her sharp eyes burned with an undeniable, fierce authority. She commanded her nurse to stop the wheelchair right in the center of the ruined engagement party. The 200 wealthy guests held their collective breath, watching the ghost of the Whitfield Empire return from the dead to exact her revenge. Harriet lifted her trembling, wrinkled hand and pointed a single finger directly at the monster holding the silver pistol. "Put the gun down, you pathetic thief," Harriet commanded, her aged voice cutting through the deadly silence like a cracking whip. Tanya froze completely, her manicured fingers slipping slightly against the cold metal of the weapon. Harriet publicly denounced her cruel granddaughter in front of the entire terrified high society crowd, sparing no gruesome detail. She revealed that the bank had called her that very morning to report massive, unauthorized withdrawals from her private accounts. Tanya had forged her grandmother's signature and ruthlessly drained $1.8 million from the family trust. The shocking revelation echoed through the grand hall, completely exposing Tanya as a desperate, broke criminal who had nothing left to lose. In that exact, fatal second, the psychotic bride lost her absolute focus. Tanya's wild eyes darted away from her hostage and locked onto her grandmother in pure, unadulterated shock. The silver pistol lowered by just one single inch, but that tiny mistake was everything the Mafia boss needed. Bryce Harrington struck like a viper, moving with a blinding, lethal speed that defied human logic. He completely ignored his own safety and lunged across the short distance in a blur of tailored black fabric. His massive hand clamped down like an iron vice around Tanya's armed wrist, violently wrenching her arms straight up toward the painted ceiling. Tanya screamed in primal rage, her finger instinctively pulling the trigger in a blind, terrified panic. The silver pistol fired with a deafening, thunderous crack that echoed brutally off the marble walls. The stray bullet tore straight into the center of the massive crystal chandelier hanging high above the stage. The heavy fixture instantly exploded, raining thousands of sharp, glittering glass shards down like a terrifying, beautiful diamond storm. Tanya fought back like a feral cat, twisting wildly out of Bryce's iron grip as the smoking gun clattered uselessly onto the polished floor. Stripped of her primary weapon, Tanya wildly reached into the folds of her ruined gold dress and pulled out a hidden, razor-sharp knife. She lunged forward with a deranged shriek, aiming a desperate, lethal slash right at Bryce's chest. But she completely forgot about the woman standing right beside her, and that was her final, fatal mistake. Melody refused to be a helpless, shivering victim for another single second of her life. The brave housekeeper grabbed a heavy, water-filled porcelain vase from the nearest overturned banquet table. She lifted the massive vase high into the air and swung it down with every ounce of strength she possessed. The heavy ceramic smashed directly over Tanya's head with a sickening thud, exploding into a dozen wet, jagged pieces. White lilies and cold water sprayed across the stage, and Tanya's eyes rolled straight back into her head. The psychotic socialite collapsed completely unconscious, hitting the marble floor cold amid the falling rain of shattered glass. 3 days after the shattered crystal fell and the police sirens faded, the Harrington mansion was finally quiet. Tanya was locked away in a federal cell, but Bryce knew a liar always left a trail behind. He walked into Tanya's private study with his most trusted lawyer and a heavy industrial drill. They tore down the false wood paneling hidden behind a massive painting and exposed a heavy, fireproof steel safe. The drill whined against the metal for nearly an hour before the thick door finally swung open with a heavy groan. The dark space inside was a complete treasury of pure evil and calculated betrayal. Bryce pulled out stack after stack of black ledgers detailing hitman payoffs, offshore accounts, and massive embezzlement. But right at the very bottom of the safe lay a single, yellowed envelope sealed tightly in thick plastic. Bryce sliced the plastic open with a silver letter opener and pulled out an old, creased birth certificate. He read the faded ink on the fragile paper, and the blood completely drained from his face as a horrifying puzzle finally snapped together. Bryce immediately sent Vincent to bring Melody up to the third-floor study. The young woman walked into the room with nervous steps, her hands twisting anxiously in the fabric of her simple dress. Bryce did not speak from behind his massive oak desk, but he gently pushed the aged birth certificate across the polished wood. He pointed a steady finger directly at the line reserved for the father's name, and he told her to read it aloud. Melody leaned forward, her brow furrowing in deep confusion as she whispered the name Preston Whitfield. Bryce looked at her with a profound, aching gentleness that he reserved only for her. He explained that Preston was Harriet Whitfield's eldest and most beloved son, the man who had died in a tragic accident decades ago. Melody was not just a nameless orphan pulled from the unforgiving streets to scrub floors and wash dishes. She was the true, blood granddaughter of the Whitfield Empire and the rightful, primary heir to a massive fortune. The heavy study doors clicked open before Melody could even process the absolute shock of her new reality. Harriet Whitfield rolled her motorized wheelchair into the quiet room, her sharp, elderly eyes immediately locking onto the trembling girl. The fierce matriarch ignored the stacks of stolen money and the ledgers of blood, focusing only on the deep brown eyes of the housekeeper. Harriet lifted her shaking, wrinkled hand, her voice cracking with a lifetime of buried grief and sudden, overwhelming hope. "You have Preston's exact eyes, my sweet girl, the same gentle eyes of the son I thought I lost forever," she whispered. Melody fell to her knees right there on the expensive Persian rug, and the thick walls she had built to survive the streets completely collapsed. She wrapped her arms around the frail old woman, sobbing with the shattered, beautiful relief of a lost child finally finding her way home. Harriet stroked Melody's dark hair, her own tears falling freely onto the girl's shoulders as the two generations reconnected after 27 agonizing years in the dark. But as the beautiful reunion unfolded in the quiet study, a dark, horrifying realization began to settle over the room. Bryce stood by the window, his jaw clenching with a fresh, violent surge of protective rage. Tanya had hidden this birth certificate in her private safe for years, meaning she knew the absolute truth the entire time. The psychotic villain had intentionally hunted down her own blood cousin just to hire her as a lowly, invisible maid. Tanya had forced the true Whitfield heir to scrub her floors, wash her clothes, and endure daily, agonizing humiliation just to satisfy her own twisted, sadistic ego. She wanted to enslave and entirely erase the rightful heir while stealing the massive fortune that belonged to Melody. The sheer cruelty of the plot was enough to make any normal person lose their mind with hatred. But Melody simply wiped her tears, holding her grandmother's aged hand tightly, completely refusing to let Tanya's dark poison infect her beautiful new dawn. Seeking absolute closure, Melody insisted on visiting Tanya at the maximum security federal penitentiary. Bryce drove her to the gray concrete fortress, but he waited outside to let her face her demon completely alone. Melody sat in the cramped visitation room, staring quietly through a thick pane of smudged bulletproof glass. The heavy metal door clicked open, and Tanya walked in wearing a wrinkled orange jumpsuit that hung loosely on her thinning frame. The former socialite looked pale and hollow, completely stripped of her sparkling diamonds and her stolen gold. But her eyes remained just as bitter, burning with an unrepentant, toxic hatred that refused to die. Tanya picked up the heavy black receiver and immediately began spitting venom at Melody's newfound wealth. She violently mocked the emerald dress and sneered at the Whitfield name, completely refusing to admit she had lost the war. But Melody did not flinch, and she did not let a single drop of that dark poison infect her healing heart. She looked at her broken cousin with profound peace, realizing the woman across the glass was already dead inside. Melody simply leaned closer to the glass and whispered that she forgave her for every single cruel thing she had done. She hung up the heavy phone and walked away without looking back, leaving the villain to rot alone in a miserable cage of her own hatred. 1 exact year later, the dark clouds over the Harrington estate had completely cleared away to reveal a brilliant blue sky. A stunning outdoor garden wedding was taking place on the sprawling, perfectly manicured lawns of the massive property. The atmosphere was no longer suffocating and cold, but it was filled with genuine laughter and blooming white roses. The guest list was a beautiful, chaotic mix of two entirely different worlds finally bleeding together in absolute harmony. High society elites in tailored suits sat side by side with the working-class folks from Melody's painful past. Everyone was completely equal under the warm afternoon sun, sharing cold champagne and joyful, genuine tears. Harriet Whitfield sat in the very front row in her motorized wheelchair, beaming with absolute pride as she watched her true granddaughter. Martha, the loyal cook, sat right beside her, holding the two growing toddler twins safely in her lap. The soft notes of an acoustic guitar drifted through the warm breeze as Melody walked slowly down the flower-strewn aisle. She wore a simple, breathtaking white lace gown, her dark hair woven with fresh flowers, looking like an absolute angel stepping into the glorious light. Bryce stood waiting at the altar in a sharp black suit, his lethal edge completely softened by a profound, overwhelming love. The feared Mafia boss took her small, scarred hands into his own, and his cold gray eyes shone with unshed tears. He promised to fiercely protect her, to love her, and to burn the entire world down if anything ever threatened their peace again. Melody smiled through her tears, promising to stand bravely by his side through every violent storm and every quiet morning. They exchanged their golden rings, sealing a beautiful promise forged in the darkest and coldest of places. But before the priest could pronounce them husband and wife, Melody stepped back with a radiant, mischievous smile lighting up her face. She gently placed her hand over her flat stomach, looking up at the terrifying mob boss with absolute, boundless joy. She whispered that their perfect family was growing, and they were finally going to have a beautiful baby of their own. Bryce completely froze, his jaw dropping in pure shock before he let out a loud, triumphant laugh that echoed across the estate. He pulled her into a massive, breathless kiss as the entire garden erupted into deafening cheers and thunderous applause. And that is how a broken maid and a ruthless mafia boss built a beautiful empire of love out of absolute ashes. This story reminds us that true nobility does not come from a bank account, and monsters can easily wear designer clothes and perfect smiles. It teaches us that courage means standing up to the dark, and pure kindness will always find a way to reward a gentle heart. Even when life throws you into the absolute freezing depths, you must never lose your faith in the coming light. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredible, emotional journey here at Sunni Romance. If this gritty tale of survival and true love touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable stories. We pour our absolute souls into these videos, and your support means the absolute world to us. What did you think about Melody's incredible bravery and Bryce's fierce, unwavering loyalty? Have you ever had to forgive someone who deeply wronged you just to find your own inner peace? Please share your thoughts in the comments below, because we read every single one of them and cherish your beautiful words. We wish you endless happiness, profound peace, and the absolute courage to build your own beautiful dawn.